He has done it. Max Verstappen joins Alain Prost and Sebastian Vettel as a four-time Formula One world champion after doing exactly what he needed to do in the Las Vegas Grand Prix as George Russell led home a Mercedes 1-2. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined as ever by lead editor Ian Parks, who has once again gone above and beyond for the update background. He has got the sphere. Ian, it looks amazing. It's obviously an amazing night in Las Vegas for Red Bull. Max Verstappen, quite simply, a four-time world champion. He did what he needed to do.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Let's start out with that first of all. I was hoping, as you pointed out, I've come out with a sphere, and ironically, we have the Mercedes emblem going around. We're talking about Max Verstappen being a four-time world champion with Red Bull. I was hoping to come out to the sphere and have the Max Verstappen backdrop that they did put on the sphere earlier after he did become that four-time champion, of course. Was it ever in any doubt, Nick? Really? Was it? No, of course. It's been a tremendous season. And the biggest thing to come out of this, I think, is the praise that Max Verstappen has received from everyone in the paddock. Of course, from everyone within Red Bull, Christian Horner, Helmut Marko, Pierre Vacher, but his peers, Fernando Alonso in particular, effusive in his praise. Lewis Hamilton as well. And of course, you've mentioned Lando Norris, describing Max as arguably the best ever. Of course, it's always going to be arguably, because trying to compare drivers from one era against drivers of another era who equally dominated that particular era, it's always going to be a subjective conversation. But right now, Max Verstappen is most definitely the best driver of this current era. Is he the best ever? That's one of those great debates that people will have around a dinner table at a bar, wherever that you might be. And it's always going to be a wonderful conversation and debate as well. But Max did the job. Was this his best season ever? Now, that's another topic for debate. Max was actually asked that in the in the champions press conference after his tremendous performance today, getting the points he needed, getting the results he needed to carry him over the line. And again, it's another debate. Do you look at 2021, that titanic tussle with Lewis Hamilton? Do you look at 2022, first year of the new regulations, tremendous performance across the entire season? But of course, that is probably then usurped 2022 by 2023 and the most dominant season of all time, when car and driver were just absolutely in harmony. Or do you look at this one, when Max really had to fight for this, came flying out the blocks, but then it was a case of he didn't have the best car. He knew that. He said that for 70% of this season. He said he didn't have the fastest car, and he's really had to fight tooth and nail to drag results and performances out of that car. And when you look at it, for Christian Horner, he feels that this was right up there with the 2021 performance and that titanic tussle, as I say, with Lewis Hamilton. It is that subjective debate, and it's one of those. And before you say it, Nick, tell us in the comments, folks, whether you feel this was Max Verstappen's best season or not. It's one of those that it's for very different reasons why it was so good compared to the dominance of 2023, compared to that last race victory over Lewis in 2021. Bottom line is, he's a four-time world champion. He joins an exclusive club. Only 6 drivers now, including Max, that can claim to be in that category. Fair play to him. He has delivered this season. And congratulations, Max, from all of us at Racing News 365. You have deserved it at the end of the day, because you have delivered on track when it has mattered most. You have been near faultless across the course of the season. Whereas if you look at Lando Norris, of course, his main title rival, then we have seen mistakes from Lando. And that is really why he has not challenged Max right to the wire.
And that's a really good point on Lando, because actually you look at the opening day in Las Vegas and Red Bull were nowhere. They made these drastic changes to the rear wing, which also we saw being made. And of course, Max then recovered brilliantly in qualifying to get into Q3 to qualify ahead of Lando. And actually in the race, made an excellent start, was second at one point, fell back towards the end, back to P5 due to graining and tyre degradation. And actually just playing it safe, something we don't see too often from Max, because actually he knew that the title was effectively in the bag because McLaren was simply this weekend just not at the races.
Max did what he needed to do today. And as you say, he played it safe. Why put up a
Yeah.
fight against Lewis coming through, against the Ferraris coming through? There was no need for him to do that. On another day, of course, when it would have mattered, or
Yeah.
when he would have needed to have done something like that, yes, of course, he would have put up a far greater fight than was necessary. But of course, he would have had the messages being fed back to him by his race engineer, Giampiero Lambiase, that Lando Norris really was not at the races today. Lando knows that. He said that post-race. He's worried about the car going forward into Qatar and Abu Dhabi because, of course, McLaren have been reeled in yet again by Ferrari. And that gap between McLaren and Ferrari now is down to just 24 points. It was 36 coming into this Grand Prix. Another third has been shaved off that. This looks like it could go to the wire in Abu Dhabi for the constructors title. And it's a good old classic battle from yesteryear, McLaren v Ferrari, because Red Bull, 55 points, I think, is the gap now,
Yeah.
Nick. I think we can say, even though there is still a good chunk of points on the table, that they are probably out of the reckoning on this occasion. They're not going to retain their constructors title. It's going to take something quite miraculous for that to happen. As I say, it's McLaren v Ferrari, but for now, Max, as we started off with this particular answer, and to your question, he did what he had to do. And that's the hallmark of his driving, a
Yeah.
mature drive. I think that's one of the main points that's come out from many of those that have spoken about his drive, his performance across the course of the season, his maturity. And yes, of course, he is now, got many seasons behind him, all those race victories. Now he's got this fourth title. Yes, Max Verstappen is a much more mature driver, and that is to his credit that he knows now about how to craft not just a Grand Prix performance, but also how to craft a title-winning performance as well, as we're seeing throughout the course of this season.
And of course, we will discuss Max's title victory in much more detail in Monday's podcast, because there is so much to discuss in the podcast, but also in this F1 update. And of course, we've got to discuss Mercedes, a team who we saw throughout the weekend had excellent one-lap pace. They were unsure over the race pace. Everyone was looking at Ferrari for the favourites for the victory. Let's say that was definitely not the case. George Russell converting pole position into victory. Lewis Hamilton fighting from 10th to 2nd with ease. He said himself that actually, had he not made mistakes in qualifying, the victory would have essentially been a breeze. I mean, Mercedes, exceptional. Toto Wolff saying that at times the W15 was 2 seconds a lap faster than anybody else. I mean, this is Mercedes of yesteryear.
You know, one of the funniest comments that's arguably come out of this weekend, and it just gives you the idea as to the conditions here, the track here, how very different it is to any circuit across the course of this 24 race Grand Prix calendar. Christian Horner, whilst praising Mercedes for their qualifying pace, after qualifying, turned around and said that he felt their race pace was nowhere. So guess what? Look where Mercedes race pace was. Absolutely nailed on. And George delivered pretty much faultless weekend when you think
Yeah.
great pole position. And his race performance was such that he was almost anonymous on the TV coverage because so much else was going on behind him. And of course, a great deal of focus on Max and where he was positioned against Lando, of course. But there were some great drives going on, some great overtaking maneuvers. This is one of the great things about this circuit. It does lend itself to superb overtaking. This race wasn't quite as chaotic as last season, but nevertheless, it still produced a great race as far as I'm concerned. Maybe the last 10, 12 laps or so, they just drifted a little bit off the boil, but nevertheless, I thought that was a good race again today, a great race again today. I really enjoyed it. I don't know about yourself, Nick. I don't know about yourself, viewers, listeners, as to your thoughts on this one. Probably the biggest disappointment for Mercedes was the feelings of Lewis Hamilton, because
Yeah.
he knows he could have won that race. He knows that in Q3, he let himself down because
Mm.
he probably had the measure of George Russell in practice in the first two portions of quality, Q2 in particular, when he was quickest, but Q3, when he had to nail it, he had two mistakes, started 10th. He produced a great drive. It said, Lewis said that it reminded him of his Rye House karting days, the way he came through the field. And he was closing in on George at quite a rate of knots, but then the gap just stabilized at around 5 seconds. And then George was actually given a G up by his race engineer just to kind of like let him know that Lewis is coming for you. But as I said, George managed to maintain that gap. Lewis actually made another little mistake late on in that race as well. But as I say, this was arguably one of those that really got away from Lewis, because he in particular has had a really tough time. Mercedes has had
Yeah.
a tough time, it all told, since the summer break. I think having gone into it with those 3 wins in 4, and we all thought at that particular point in time, Mercedes is going to come on strong now over the second half of the season. It's just not happened for them until we've come here. The conditions have played into the window that Mercedes likes to operate with that car. And as I say, overall, a great weekend for George, but one that got away from Lewis as he approaches the end of his time with Mercedes. One he's probably going to look back on with a little bit of regret come the close of this season and before he goes on to Ferrari.
And actually, Mercedes, one advantage they did have in the race, given the weird conditions, and actually Toto Wolff called this advantage strange, is that on the medium compound and the hard compound, both Russell and Lewis had no tyre graining, no tyre degradation. The same cannot be said for Ferrari. Charles Leclerc had great pace in the opening laps, but fell off dramatically in the first stint due to pushing too hard, and in the end, Leclerc and Sainz, seemingly not the best of friends, come into the race. Charles Leclerc with a very X-rated radio message to the team, it's fair to say, and it seems that all is not well at Ferrari, at least between the two drivers.
Well, Charles going to be bidding Carlos farewell in 2
Oh,
weeks'
yeah.
time, so shouldn't really have too much to concern himself with, in all honesty. I mean, it doesn't really matter as to where those two finished in the pecking order. They still
Yeah.
managed to get the maximum number of points out of their respective drives compared to McLaren. As you say, we all expected coming out of qualifying, and you predicted it ahead of what I was going to predict, was what we thought was going to be a Ferrari 1-2 at the end of
Yeah.
the day, because they looked so good, regardless of the fact that George managed to put that car on pole. We all thought that the race pace of that Ferrari had the edge over Mercedes. That was certainly not the case. And it was quite a surprise when early on, when Charles had that opportunity to overtake George around about lap 5 or 6, something like
Yeah.
that. It was quite early on anyway. He didn't quite make the move stick. And from that moment on, he just dropped back. And then you thought, hello, what's going on here? And it was pretty obvious, as you say, graining, degradation played its part. And for both Carlos and Charles, they suffered with the same thing. We saw multiple pit stops, of course. And it's one of those, yes, of course, Charles is going to be angry with what happened. And as you say, it was a little bit X-rated, of course, wasn't it? It's one of
A
those
few
things that,
F-bombs.
a few F-bombs, it's one of those that Mohammed Ben Sulayem was been
Yeah.
bemoaning earlier in the season, that he doesn't want to hear his
That's a good
drivers
point. Yeah.
swearing like that over the radio. So, and here we go. Charles absolutely turned the air blue with his words. But as I say, Carlos just took advantage. Did
Yeah.
it really matter for Ferrari who finished ahead? Not really. As I've pointed out here, Nick, it doesn't matter who was third and who was fourth at the end of the day. So they've still maximised, given that car on this particular given day, the number of points that were available to them, given how well Mercedes performed in getting that 1-2. They've still taken 12 points out of McLaren. Obviously, Lando Norris did manage to get the fastest lap at the end when he switched to a soft tyre run. So at least a little bit of assistance there for McLaren going into these final two races, that they've kept the gap, as I say, to 24 points. It could have been that marginally a little bit worse, but they've got a lot of work to do, McLaren. And looking at Ferrari as well, they will be scratching their heads thinking, well, we've also got the same going into these last two races. It is going to be nip and tuck between the two teams, I do believe, and it is going to go down to the wire in Abu Dhabi. So at least we've got something riding on this season, even if Max has now won his fourth world title with 2 Grand Prix to go.
Absolutely. And just to quickly go through the top 10 from the Las Vegas Grand Prix, George Russell claimed victory ahead of Lewis Hamilton, Carlos Sainz, Charles Leclerc, Max Verstappen in 5th, Norris 6th, Oscar Piastri 7th, Nico Hulkenberg in 8th, Yuki Tsunoda in 9th, and Sergio Perez in 10th. Ian, just finally on the topic of crucial positions, and there has been yet another change in the midfield battle. Alpine, what was looking like potentially being a brilliant day with Pierre Gasly qualifying in 3rd. He retired early on. Esteban Ocon had a bizarre incident in the pit lane where he went into the pit lane and Alpine were not ready for him. Nico Hulkenberg crucially finishing in 8th ahead of Yuki Tsunoda in 9th, meaning that Haas have moved back into 6th, 1 point ahead of Alpine. We speak about nip and tuck into Abu Dhabi, and well, the battle for 6th looks like it is going to go down to the very last lap of the season.
1 point ahead of Alpine, 4 points ahead of RB. So it is still anything to play for. And Nico Hulkenberg's pass on Yuki Tsunoda late in that race, of course, how crucial could that be in the end? Because if those positions had been reversed, there would have been 1 point between the 3 teams going into the last 2 Grand Prix. But it is still everything to play for those guys. We know what's on the line in terms of revenue from the finishing position in the Constructors' Championship. You can't call it at the moment. Certainly, Pierre Gasly and Alpine, he seems to have the qualifying edge over his rivals. And as you say, 3rd place on the grid for this Grand Prix. You can imagine his bitter disappointment in the pen, having spoken to him his very short race. I was going to say post-race, but of course, his was considerably short because of the issue with his car. He was extremely disappointed because he knew that there was an opportunity on the table there for him collecting a good number of points again, and for Alpine to extend that advantage over Haas and RB. It's going to be a fascinating tussle because all 6 drivers across those 3 teams have got an awful lot to play for in Qatar and Abu Dhabi.
Absolutely. And of course, for those watching this video, let us know in the comment section below which team you think will get 6th. And let us know your thoughts on anything we have discussed. As Ian mentioned earlier, was this Max Verstappen's greatest title? Be sure to let us know in the comments. Ian, get home safely. Me and Ian will be back on Monday for the Racing News 365 podcast with Sam Coop after a week off. We're both back. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel. And from myself and Ian, we'll see you in the podcast on Monday. See you later.
And from Las Vegas, folks, and I hope you've enjoyed the Sphere show in the background. I think that's my favourite backdrop of the season so far. Don't think I'm going to be able to better this one, to be honest. As I say, I hope you've enjoyed it, and take care as always.